Howdy, it's Kyle talking about Cleveland. I'll be discussing the urban structure, downtown, and a bunch of other neighborhoods, walkability, public transit, housing costs, companies headquartered in the city, the lakefront and beaches, the climate, the music and food scene, and one of the coolest parks I've been to that I can't believe isn't more well known. But I'm also not working for the Chamber of Commerce, so I will go into some of the negative things that affect the city, including high poverty and crime. But could it be that Cleveland, the mistake on the lake, is actually kind of cool? Let's find out. Cleveland has a population of about 367,000 people, which makes it the second largest city in Ohio and the 54th largest city in the US. It's been losing people for quite a while now. The 1950 census was the last census in which the city gained population, and there was a huge population decline between 2000 and 2010. And although the city does continue to lose people, the rate of decline has gone down a lot in recent years as well. The immediate metropolitan area has about 2.2 million people, which ranks at about 34th in the US, and the overall combined metro area, which usually includes Akron and Canton, has about 3.3 million. It's the largest city on Lake Erie, and being on the lake has played an important role in the city's history. The Cuyahoga River flows south to north through the city and empties out into Lake Erie downtown. And the part of town alongside the river is called the Industrial Valley, and this is where you have a lot of factories sitting right there on the river. Downtown is the north central part of the city on and near the lakefront, and I would say that overall the downtown is one of the better ones for big cities in the US. It's compact and older and very easy to get around by foot. In the heart of downtown is the Mall of Cleveland, which was renovated in 2013, and this is the convention center remodeled underneath some green space. This is a really cool idea, and it won some international awards for urban design as a result. The North Coast Harbor is appropriately named as it's the north end of downtown right along the Lakeshore. This is where you have the harbor and the port of Cleveland, as well as a cruise ship terminal for people to take cruises around Lake Erie. And this is also where there are several museums and attractions, including the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Great Lakes Science Center, the Women's Air and Space Museum. The USS COD submarine is on display, and this is also where you have the Cleveland Browns football stadium. There are several entertainment districts in the city. One is along East 4th Street at the southern end of downtown. And this is a very lively area with a lot of bars and restaurants close to the baseball stadium and basketball arena. In the west part of downtown is an area called the Flats, and this is a place that's undergone gentrification multiple times through the years. And so after its most recent wave of gentrification, the area has a lot of bars and restaurants and a really nice waterfront boardwalk as well. Playhouse Square is the theater district downtown, and this is the largest performing arts district in the country outside of New York City. There are several highly regarded theaters in this district, and the main intersection in the part of town has a giant chandelier over it. Just west of downtown is the part of town called Ohio City, another area with a lot of entertainment options and restaurants and shops. In the Ohio City neighborhood is the West Side Market, one of the best public markets in the country. It's in a beautiful old building, but when I was there, it was under construction, so it was just scaffolding all around it. And this is a great place to sample so many of the great local foods in the area. Meats and sausages, cheese, breads, pastries, desserts. And if you're doing it right, you've got one person cooking up something for you in one stall while you're ordering something else from another one. Going west of there is yet another entertainment district called Gordon Square. This is an area with a lot of local art galleries and more restaurants, theaters, and nightlife. If you were to start from downtown and drive west along the lakefront leaving the city, you would go through the part of town called the Detroit Shoreway. And before the interstate was built, this was the main road you would take to get from Cleveland to Detroit. And in general, this is kind of a young, cool, hip part of town. In the east central part of the city, you have a couple of very interesting neighborhoods. One is Little Italy, and this is a really impressive tight cluster of Italian restaurants and eateries. It's almost more like a nightlife district. There were a ton of people out eating dinner a little bit later than usual. And I would say that Little Italy in New York is the only one in the country that has more restaurants or that's more of a cluster of Italian type eateries. Also in the same part of town is the huge Cleveland Clinic and Medical District. The Cleveland Clinic is one of the largest and most highly respected medical centers in the entire world. It employs over 50,000 people in the area. It takes up a pretty large chunk of area in this part of town, and adjacent to it is the campus of Case Western Reserve University. This is an excellent university, and they have their own large medical school there. So this part of town is a big medical district, but it isn't just the medical center itself. There's also a lot of biotechnology research and other high-tech things going on with Case Western Reserve. And also in this same general part of town is the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Museum of Natural History, and the Botanical Gardens. In general, the east side of Cleveland is usually associated with being the bad part of town, but this area around Little Italy and the Medical Center and the University District is pretty nice. To the northwest of this area is a neighborhood called Hough, and this was home to some infamous race riots back in the 1960s, and to this day is still a fairly poor neighborhood, although I did see some signs of gentrification coming into this neighborhood. And although Hough might be the most well-known name in terms of poor neighborhoods in Cleveland, I think what is actually the poorest and highest crime neighborhood in the city is the part of town simply called Central Cleveland. This is the part of town where you have the largest number of gang violence and just violent crime in general. And when people talk about the worst of the worst crime and poverty in Cleveland, it's often going to be in this part of town. And in fact, Cleveland as a whole is the city with the highest percentage of the population living in poverty, about 31%. And to go along with the high rate of poverty, the city is also home to one of the highest violent crime rates in the country. But like most other cities, the most violent part of the city is concentrated in the poorest parts of town. And for Cleveland, it's Central Cleveland, and some of the other really poor neighborhoods with high violent crime include Broadway and Fairfax. South of downtown in Central Cleveland is the part of town called the Industrial Valley. And this is the part of town that back in the 1960s got a lot of attention because the Cuyahoga River flowing right through this part of town caught on fire. However, the images of the river being so polluted that it caught on fire was the catalyst that led to the Clean Water Act of 1972. And there are certainly many other neighborhoods in Cleveland, but I did want to just go over some of the most interesting ones. In terms of overall layout, I would say that a good majority of Cleveland is pretty nice. It's either middle class or working class, or it's downtown, or it's business type areas. But the parts of Cleveland that are bad are really bad. Again, the worst urban poverty in America. In many ways, the city is like St. Louis in that the parts that are bad are really, really bad, although most of the city is still pretty nice. Now I want to talk a little bit about the park system in Cleveland. One thing I think that's important about living in a big city is having a good park system and a good amount of green space. Cleveland doesn't have one giant urban park like Central Park, but it does have a large number of medium-sized parks all throughout the city. A couple of the best parks are right along the Lakeshore. One is Edgewater Park and Edgewater Beach. This is a popular spot with a sandy beach, although I will say amongst all the big cities along the Great Lakes, this is one of the weaker big city beaches. But nonetheless, it is still nice to have a beach basically right there downtown. A spot that's perhaps a little more interesting is the Lakefront Nature Preserve. And this is a protected wooded area on a small peninsula jutting out into the lake. At the extreme southwest end of the city near the airport, you have the Rocky River Nature Center. And this is the best wooded area in the Metro Park system. It's got several miles of trails and almost feels like a little pocket of wilderness in the city. And it's worth mentioning that you have Cuyahoga Valley National Park just south of the city. Depending on where you're coming from in Cleveland, it could take between 15 and 30 minutes to get there, but you do have miles of hiking trails right there near the city between Cleveland and Akron. And I want to make special mention of a really cool park in the city called the Cleveland Cultural Gardens. This is a several mile long wooded parkway that follows a creek. It starts in the area around the Botanical Garden and the Museum of Natural History and goes up to the Lakefront Nature Preserve. And what's so cool about this is that there are over 30 little gardens here that represent many of the cultural groups that have emigrated to Cleveland. And there are also several more that are being created. So I spent basically half a day just walking up and down this parkway visiting all these little gardens. And I was literally the only person walking up and down this parkway visiting these gardens. There were a handful of people riding a bike or jogging along the parkway, but nobody else was visiting these gardens. I'm not sure how well known this parkway and these gardens are, but I do think it's a little underappreciated. So if you're in town for a conference or for a few days or whatever, do check out the Cultural Gardens. It's really cool. In terms of walkability, I don't think Cleveland is one of the best cities in the country, but I do think it is above average when compared to the other big cities. And that's pretty much in line with WalkScore that ranks U.S. cities in terms of walkability. They have Cleveland ranked a little above average. So the entire downtown and the areas to the west are all fairly walkable, and the areas around the Cleveland Clinic and Little Italy and University Circle are all pretty walkable as well, but the parts in between are where it's not really great for walking. This could include parts of town kind of like the Industrial Valley or just some of the really high crime parts of town you might not want to be walking through. But with that being said, there is a decent amount of gentrification going on in the parts of town between downtown and the Cleveland Clinic. And this is Midtown, and you're seeing more interest in people wanting to move to this part of town between downtown and the cool parts in the east central part of the city. In terms of public transit, Cleveland is ranked fairly high compared to the other big cities. There are several different light rail lines, a heavy rail line, and a pretty extensive bus network as well. And kind of like how I was saying you might not want to walk between the walkable parts of town, there is an express bus line that goes from downtown to the Little Italy University part of town. So Cleveland is a city where you can live a car-free life with decent walkability and good public transit. In terms of cost of living, Cleveland is a relatively affordable city in which to buy a house. It's still well within reason to buy a house in Cleveland in the $200,000 range on a quiet street in a nice neighborhood in a good part of town. And if you're okay with a fixer-upper or being in a neighborhood that's slightly rough around the edges, you can get a place in the $100,000 range. And I think that's why you're starting to see a decent number of younger people move into some of these neighborhoods that are being gentrified in Midwestern and Northeastern cities. With the cost of owning a home becoming more and more expensive, one of the most affordable places in which to buy one is the central city of a large metro in the Rust Belt. For companies headquartered in the city, there are 4 very large ones: Key Bank, Progressive Insurance, Sherwin-Williams Paints, and Parker Hannifin Hydraulics. I think a couple of these are actually in an inner ring suburb, but these are 4 major players in terms of the Cleveland economy. The city had much more of an industrial and blue-collar history, but when many of those factories closed down, the economy really suffered. And this is the same story that happened throughout many other cities, but for Cleveland it was a little bit worse than for most others. And so many of those factories closing down is what led to an increase in poverty, which led to an increase in crime. And most people would say those are the worst things about Cleveland, but for me, the worst thing about Cleveland are the winters. The winters are really cold, windy, and snowy with the lake effect snow. Now the lake effect does get worse as you go northeast up the Lakeshore into Ashtabula and Erie and Buffalo, but it is still pretty bad in Cleveland. Low temperatures are bad enough, but combined with high winds and lots of snow, man, that's rough. Now I want to make a quick mention of Cleveland's most iconic food, the Polish Boy sandwich. And this is a Polish sausage on a bun topped with French fries, coleslaw, and barbecue sauce. I've never had one, and they look downright horrifying, but in a good way. The city is also well known for how it does corned beef, although corned beef is something that is not special to Cleveland. Now I want to mention a little bit about the music coming out of Cleveland. The city is home to a unique style of polka music called Cleveland Style Polka, and the city was home to the American polka king, Frankie Yankovic. And in fact, the city is home to the Cleveland Polka Hall of Fame. Something else interesting about Cleveland music is that it's home to the Tyagaraja Festival, which is the largest Indian music and dance festival in the world outside of India. The festival goes on for 12 days each April and is in its 44th year. A couple of big name rap artists have come out of the city, Bone Thugs and Harmony and Kid Cudi. But what about all the great rock and roll acts that come out of Cleveland? It's home to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame after all. People from Cleveland will say otherwise, but the only reason the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is there is because the city paid the guy to build it there. After Cleveland was chosen, they did some kind of backdoor reasoning because the guy that invented the term rock and roll was from Cleveland, but come on, man, that's not why it's there. And there surprisingly aren't really any major rock and roll acts to come out of Cleveland, so many great things about the city, but the rock scene isn't one of them. In summary, I would say that Cleveland is perhaps the most underrated city in America. Like many other places, people really focus on the negative, and the negatives in Cleveland are pretty bad. Again, that poverty is the worst in the country, and the crime rates are really bad too, but most of the city is pretty nice, normal place, and a good place to live and a good place to visit. So that's my take on Cleveland. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography from a nerdy perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King signing out, and about to go toss a match into the Tennessee River and see what happens. I'd like to give a special thanks to my superior patrons for their support, especially Vinny P. If you're interested in purchasing a pin for the viewer pin map or just to support the channel, check out my Patreon page, link in the description. And as always, thank you very much.